On November 8, 1599, a Dutch ship called the Mauritius dropped anchor in the port of Amsterdam after a 2-year voyage to the East Indies. The ship's cargo hold was filled with 600,000 pounds of spices, primarily pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and mace. When the cargo was sold at auction, it generated a profit of 400% for the investors. 400% in 2 years. The news spread through Amsterdam like wildfire. Merchants, bankers, aristocrats, even shopkeepers rushed to invest in the next expedition. Within months, multiple competing Dutch companies were fitting out fleets to sail to the Spice Islands. The scramble had begun. But this wasn't just about profit. The spice trade would become the catalyst for the largest land grab in human history. Within 150 years, European powers would control most of the world, carving up continents, enslaving millions, and reshaping global civilization. And it all started with tiny aromatic seeds and dried bark that grew on a handful of remote islands in what is now Indonesia. This is the story of how a single spice and the obsessive European hunger for it ignited the colonial scramble that would dominate the next 4 centuries and create the world we live in today. To understand why spices mattered so much, you have to understand medieval and early modern Europe. In the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, life was hard, food was bland, and preservation was a constant challenge. There was no refrigeration. Meat had to be salted or smoked to prevent rotting. The diet was monotonous, dominated by bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables were in season. The wealthy could afford meat, but even for them, the meat was often old, tough, and tasted of decay. Spices changed everything. Pepper, the most common spice, didn't just add flavor. It had antimicrobial properties that helped preserve food. It masked the taste of meat that was starting to spoil. It made the unbearable edible. But pepper was just the beginning. Cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and mace were luxury goods that signaled wealth and status. A nobleman's table laden with heavily spiced dishes was a display of power and sophistication. Spices were also believed to have medicinal properties. They were used to treat everything from plague to indigestion. Apothecaries sold spices as medicine. Physicians prescribed them. The demand was insatiable, and the problem was supply. All of these valuable spices came from a tiny region of the world. Pepper came primarily from the Malabar coast of India. Cinnamon came from Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. But the most valuable spices, cloves, nutmeg, and mace, came from an even more restricted area. They grew naturally on only a handful of islands in the Maluku Islands, also called the Moluccas, or the Spice Islands, in what is now eastern Indonesia. The Moluccas were remote, tiny, and unknown to most of the world. Cloves grew on just 5 small islands. Nutmeg grew on even fewer, primarily the Banda Islands, a cluster of volcanic specks in the middle of the ocean. These islands had the perfect climate, the perfect soil, the perfect conditions for these trees to thrive, and nowhere else on Earth could produce them. This created a geographic monopoly more powerful than any diamond mine or gold deposit. Whoever controlled these islands controlled the supply of the world's most valuable commodities. For centuries, the spice trade was controlled by a complex network of intermediaries. Arab traders would sail to the Spice Islands, buy the spices from local producers, and transport them to ports in India or the Persian Gulf. From there, other merchants would carry them overland through Persia or Arabia to the eastern Mediterranean. Venetian and Genoese merchants would then buy the spices in Alexandria or Constantinople and ship them to Europe. Each intermediary took a cut. By the time a pound of cloves reached the market in Paris or London, it had passed through a dozen hands, and the price had multiplied by 100 or more. A pound of nutmeg in the Banda Islands might cost a few pennies. In London, it could sell for the equivalent of several months' wages for a laborer. The markup was astronomical, and the Europeans, who were at the end of this long chain, resented it. They were paying a fortune for spices that cost almost nothing at the source, but they had no direct access to the source. The trade routes were controlled by Muslims, the Ottoman Empire, and the Italian city-states. The Europeans were locked out. This created a burning desire to find a way to bypass the intermediaries, to reach the Spice Islands directly, and to capture the profits for themselves. The Portuguese were the first to succeed. In the late 15th century, Portugal, a small kingdom on the edge of Europe, embarked on an ambitious strategy of maritime exploration. They wanted to find a sea route to India that would allow them to buy spices directly from the source and avoid the Muslim-controlled overland routes. Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored expeditions down the coast of Africa. Portuguese sailors gradually pushed further and further south, mapping the African coastline, establishing trading posts, and learning to navigate the treacherous waters. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that there was a sea route from Europe to the Indian Ocean. In 1498, Vasco da Gama completed the journey, sailing from Portugal to India and back. It was one of the most important voyages in history. Da Gama returned to Lisbon with a cargo of spices that sold for 60 times the cost of the expedition. The return on investment was staggering, and it proved that direct trade with Asia was not only possible, but enormously profitable. Portugal immediately began building an empire. They established fortified trading posts along the coasts of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. They used superior naval technology, particularly cannons mounted on ships, to intimidate and control local rulers. They didn't try to conquer vast territories, they just wanted to control the sea routes and the key ports. This was a new kind of empire, a maritime commercial empire, not a territorial one. By 1511, the Portuguese had conquered Malacca, the most important port in Southeast Asia, the gateway to the Spice Islands. From Malacca, they pushed further east, reaching the Moluccas in 1512. For the first time, Europeans were buying cloves and nutmeg directly from the islands where they grew. The Portuguese cut out all the intermediaries. They loaded their ships with spices, sailed back to Lisbon, and sold them at prices that were still high, but lower than the Venetians could offer. The Portuguese monopoly on the spice trade made Lisbon one of the richest cities in Europe, but the monopoly didn't last. Portugal was a small country with limited manpower and resources. They couldn't defend their entire network of trading posts against rivals, and the profits were too tempting for others to ignore. The Spanish, the Dutch, the English, and the French all wanted a share. The Spanish tried a different approach. Instead of sailing around Africa, they tried sailing west across the Atlantic. Christopher Columbus was attempting to reach Asia by this route when he stumbled upon the Americas in 1492. Ferdinand Magellan, sailing for Spain, successfully circumnavigated the globe between 1519 and 1522, proving that the Spice Islands could be reached by sailing west. But the Spanish ultimately focused their attention on the Americas, where they found silver and gold. The spice trade became a secondary concern. It was the Dutch who would truly challenge Portuguese dominance. The Dutch Republic in the late 16th century was a rising commercial power. Dutch merchants were skilled traders, shipbuilders, and when the Portuguese came under Spanish rule in 1580, the Dutch, who were at war with Spain, saw an opportunity. If they could break into the spice trade, they could hurt Spain financially and enrich themselves at the same time. Dutch expeditions began sailing to the East Indies in the 1590s. The voyage of the Mauritius in 1599 proved the profitability, and the profit triggered a frenzy. Between 1598 and 1601, 65 Dutch ships sailed to Asia. The competition between rival Dutch companies was fierce and inefficient. They were driving up the purchase price of spices in Asia by competing against each other and driving down the selling price in Europe by flooding the market. In 1602, the Dutch government intervened and forced the competing companies to merge into a single entity, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. The VOC was granted a monopoly on Dutch trade with Asia and extraordinary powers. It could sign treaties, wage war, build fortresses, and administer colonies. It was a private company with the powers of a sovereign state. It was one of the first joint stock companies, allowing investors to buy shares and spread the risk. And it became the most powerful corporation in history. The VOC's strategy was ruthless. They didn't just want to trade for spices. They wanted to control the production. Between 1605 and 1621, the VOC waged a brutal campaign to conquer the Spice Islands. They attacked Portuguese forts, burned villages, and massacred populations that resisted. The most infamous atrocity occurred in the Banda Islands. The Bandanese people, who had cultivated nutmeg for centuries, refused to grant the Dutch a monopoly. In 1621, the VOC governor Jan Peterson Cohen ordered a campaign of Dutch soldiers killed or enslaved nearly the entire population of the Banda Islands, an estimated 15,000 people. The survivors were replaced with Dutch colonists and slaves imported from other regions. The VOC then implemented a policy of controlled scarcity. They destroyed nutmeg and clove trees on islands they didn't directly control. They limited production to keep prices high. If a harvest was too large and threatened to lower prices, They would burn the excess spices rather than sell them cheaply. It was one of the first examples of a cartel manipulating supply to maintain high prices. The strategy worked. The VOC's profits were enormous. At its peak, the VOC paid dividends of 40% per year to its shareholders. It built a network of trading posts and colonies across Asia, from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan, and it made Amsterdam the financial capital of the world. But the Dutch obsession with spices had consequences that extended far beyond profits. The VOC's control over the Spice Islands required a base of operations. They chose Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, on the island of Java. Batavia became the headquarters of the Dutch East Indies, and to supply the garrison and the ships, the VOC needed food. Java became a plantation economy, forced to grow rice and sugar to feed the spice trade. The indigenous population was subjected to forced labor. Traditional agriculture was disrupted. The VOC was transforming entire societies to serve the spice trade. And the Dutch weren't alone. The English, not wanting to be left out, established the English East India Company in 1600. The English tried to compete with the Dutch for control of the Spice Islands, but were outmaneuvered and outgunned. After a massacre of English traders at Amboina in 1623 by the Dutch, the English largely withdrew from the Spice Islands and focused instead on India. This decision, born out of failure in the spice trade, would ultimately lead to the British conquest of India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. The spice trade had redirected English imperial ambitions. The French also established their own East India Company and competed for trade in India and Southeast Asia. The Spanish controlled the Philippines. The Portuguese clung to their remaining outposts. By the mid-17th century, the entire Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian region was carved up into European spheres of influence, all driven initially by the desire to control the spice trade. But the spice trade was changing in ways the Europeans didn't anticipate. The very success of the European monopolies contained the seeds of their own destruction. High prices incentivized smuggling and cultivation elsewhere. In the 18th century, the French successfully smuggled clove seedlings out of the Dutch-controlled Moluccas and planted them in Mauritius and later in Zambia. The British did the same with nutmeg, establishing plantations in Grenada in the Caribbean. The geographic monopoly was broken. Spices that had once grown only on a few islands in Indonesia were now being cultivated around the world. Supply increased, prices fell. By the 19th century, spices were no longer luxury goods. They were common commodities. The markup that had driven the spice trade for centuries evaporated. But by then, the colonial structures built to control the spice trade had taken on a life of their own. The VOC, which had been created to monopolize spices, evolved into the colonial government of the Dutch East Indies. What started as trading posts became colonies. What started as a search for profit became a system of exploitation and extraction that lasted for centuries. Indonesia remained a Dutch colony until 1949. India remained a British colony until 1947. The Philippines remained under Spanish and then American control until 1946. The colonial empires built to control spices outlasted the spice. Trade itself by hundreds of years, and the impact went far beyond Asia. The spice trade created the template for European colonial expansion everywhere. The model was simple. Find a valuable commodity that's produced in a specific region, establish control over that region through a combination of trade, fortification, and violence, exploit the local population for labor, extract the commodity and ship it to Europe, use the profits to fund more expansion. This model was applied to sugar in the Caribbean, to cotton in India, to rubber in the Congo, to diamonds in South Africa, to oil in the Middle East. The spice trade was the proof of concept. It showed that enormous wealth could be extracted from distant colonies with relatively small investments in ships and soldiers. It demonstrated that private companies with state backing could conquer and administer territories. It established the legal and financial structures, the joint stock company, the monopoly charter, the colonial administrator that would be used for centuries. The VOC wasn't just a spice company. It was the prototype for corporate colonialism, and the consequences were global and permanent. The wealth extracted from the spice trade and the colonies it created funded the development of Europe. Dutch bankers, English merchants, and French financiers became rich. That wealth was invested in the industries, in infrastructure, in education. It helped fund the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and eventually the Industrial Revolution. Europe's rise to global dominance in the 18th and 19th centuries was built on the wealth extracted from colonies, and the spice trade was the foundation of that system. Meanwhile, the regions that produced the spices were impoverished and exploited. The Banda Islands, once prosperous centers of nutmeg cultivation with their own culture and society, were depopulated and turned into slave plantations. Java, once home to sophisticated kingdoms, was transformed into a plantation economy serving Dutch interests. India, which had been wealthy and technologically advanced, was systematically deindustrialized by the British to ensure it remained a market for British goods and a source of raw materials. The colonial experience stunted development, destroyed indigenous economies, and created dependencies that persist to this day. Many of the poorest countries in the world today are former colonies, and many were colonized initially because they produced something that Europeans wanted. The spice trade also had profound cultural and political consequences. The Age of Exploration, which began as a search for spices, led to the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New World. This exchange reshaped ecosystems, devastated indigenous populations in the Americas through disease, and led to the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were enslaved and transported to the Americas to work on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton, commodities that followed the same colonial model pioneered in the spice trade. The modern global economy, with its vast inequalities, its patterns of exploitation, its division between wealthy industrialized nations and poor resource exporting nations, has its roots in the colonial systems established during the spice trade. There is a bitter irony in all of this. The spices that Europeans were so desperate to obtain, that they sailed around the world for, that they killed for, are today almost worthless. You can buy a pound of pepper for a few dollars. Nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon are cheap seasonings available in any grocery store. The commodity that sparked the greatest land grab in history, that led to the colonization of most of the world, that funded the rise of Europe and the exploitation of billions of people, is now something you casually sprinkle on your coffee or add to a recipe without a second thought. But the structures built to control that commodity, the colonial empires, the systems of extraction, the global inequalities, those persist. The wealth accumulated during the colonial period remains concentrated in the former colonial powers. The poverty and underdevelopment in former colonies remain entrenched. The political borders drawn by colonial administrators, often arbitrary lines cutting through ethnic and cultural groups, remain sources of conflict. The spice trade ended centuries ago, but its consequences shape the world today. The lesson of the spice trade is that markets, when combined with state power and unconstrained by ethics, can reshape the world in brutal and lasting ways. The pursuit of profit drove Europeans to sail across oceans, conquer distant lands, and exploit entire populations. The free market didn't civilize the world. It colonized the world, and the wealth it generated came at a cost that is still being paid. The spice trade also teaches us about the nature of scarcity and monopoly. The value of spices was artificially high because of geographic scarcity and monopolistic control. The Moluccas had a natural monopoly because the climate and soil were unique. The Dutch and Portuguese tried to maintain that monopoly through violence and destruction. But monopolies are inherently fragile. Once the seedlings were smuggled out and planted elsewhere, the monopoly collapsed. The prices fell. The wealth evaporated. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Coffee was once a monopoly of Yemen and Ethiopia. Then it was cultivated in the Americas. Rubber was once a monopoly of the Amazon. Then it was cultivated in Malaya. Diamonds were once scarce and valuable. Then new deposits were found. The geographic scarcity that creates monopolies and drives prices sky high is almost always temporary. But the structures built to exploit those monopolies, the colonies, the corporations, the systems of control, those can last for centuries, after the economic logic that created them has disappeared. The Dutch East Indies continued long after spices became cheap. The British Raj continued long after India was no longer a source of massive profits. The colonial momentum, once started, is hard to stop. And finally, the spice trade is a reminder of how small causes can have enormous effects. A tiny seed, a dried flower bud, an aromatic bark. These were the commodities that changed the world. Not because they were essential to survival, but because they were desirable to the wealthy and their scarcity made them profitable. If cloves and nutmeg had grown in Europe, there would have been no spice trade. The Dutch and Portuguese would not have sailed to Indonesia. The colonial empires might not have formed in the way they did. The course of history might have been different, but the spices didn't grow in Europe. They grew on remote islands that Europeans were determined to reach, and that determination, that hunger for profit, that willingness to cross oceans and commit atrocities for a product that added flavor to food, created the modern world. For better and for worse. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.